Hi, everybody. Welcome back. In this segment, we are going to pick up more or less where we left off last time. We had concluded our discussion of support vector machines. And we're going to go ahead and provide a pretty quick, just topical discussion today regarding the following. We're going to take a look at the structure of neural networks, which are a very popular machine learning tool used for both continuous prediction and regression framework, as well as classification. And we're going to talk about the CART algorithm very briefly here, which is short for classification and regression tree, which again can apply to both types of problems. The random forest is going to be really a higher level application of CART that involves a combination of really two things: resampling to build different classification trees, and then coupling that with a majority voting algorithm amongst those trees to pick the predicted class. And then we're going to go ahead at the very end and look at some unsupervised learning techniques, specifically clustering related to k-means, x-means, which is a improvement on k-means to some extent, as well as hierarchical clustering. So we're going to talk about these topically, not too technical of a conversation here, but just to give you an idea about what they are, and then in later segments we'll go ahead and delve into more details as well as implement them with a computing package. Let's go ahead and move forward here. Let's talk about neural networks. Neural networks are an extremely popular tool used for prediction. Financial institutions use them to ration credit. Security firms use them for facial recognition as well. So very, very popular. They're also extremely complicated. I would say neural networks are one of the more complicated types of models or machine learning algorithm implementations. And they are inspired by biological structure. In fact, they're not the only ones. We're going to take a look at random forests later on, which are definitely inspired by biological structure. And we use biology as an inspiration for a modeling tool frequently in engineering and science, right? We look up in the sky and we see, hey, there's a bird, right? And what does that give us inspiration for? Well, we can go ahead and build an airplane now, right? We were inspired by biological structure. Note that the function isn't exactly the same, right? We get off the ground, but the plane isn't flapping its wings. So some things we inherit from that biological structure, which may be different than the core biological function. We're going to take a look later at a random forest algorithm, which is predicated on a regression tree, which again has some biological information or some biological structure from which the actual model was inspired. So neural networks, right? What is the biological structure here? It is the human brain, right? We're looking at neurons, which are firing information. And the neural network takes some components of that biological structure and inherits them, but not everything. Okay? It's not a total replication of a neuron's functioning. Recall we had an earlier discussion in a previous segment regarding logistical regression, where we'd introduced the idea of a hard threshold, okay, where you would be passing information into a signal. And then based on the value of that signal, we either generated a binary signal, 0 or 1, right? One or the other outcomes was generated. We also saw, though, that logistic regression provided us with an example of a soft threshold, whereby we could take the same information, create that signal, pass it through, and the logistic transformation smoothed that signal out. So we got a continuous output between 0 and 1 that gave us a probability measure. Both of these pictures here essentially describe a neuron. It's taking some input data. It is doing some calculation to that input data, right? It's doing some checking of the signal, right? +1, -1, right? Or, some continuous probability in the right-hand case. And then it is spitting out some output at the end, our hypothesis here, or our prediction for F. Okay, so we can use neurons, and what a neural network is essentially it takes these neurons here and it links them up and starts feeding them together. So you essentially have regression models feeding into regression models, feeding into regression models. It's kind of a simple way to describe it. if all you knew was what a regression model was. So again, here is a basic neuron using a hard threshold. Okay, we could think about maybe doing the same thing. If we were to use a logistic transformation, we could implement a soft threshold function instead. And we'll look at that in a moment to think in a more general case. But suppose this is a hard threshold, meaning F here is a binary class that we're trying to predict. It is or it isn't, 1 or a 0. Okay, or -1 or +1, however you want to code it. So what's happening here is we're feeding each of the inputs in, right? Each of these inputs is being fed in. Okay, and then those inputs get associated with their respective weights. Right? The weights are these betas, usual betas. Those are the weights that we have to calibrate here. And we can compute the signal, and that signal goes through that hard threshold, and then we get our prediction on the right side, either a 0 or a 1. Right? That is our prediction. So you can imagine taking a bunch of these neurons and linking them together. Okay, we're now on the right side of this diagram, we have an entire network of these neurons, right? We have our input data kind of as this first layer, and we have an interior layer here, sometimes called a hidden layer, and then we have an output layer that provides us our prediction, right? So, what does that look like? Here's just an example for you to kind of think about it, but maybe, this first node here that we're looking at that I'm highlighting, perhaps that is a classifier where we have fed in, maybe we fed in an image, right? We unrolled some image data, that is our input, so that goes in here. And this first node we're looking at maybe decides whether or not that image data is a picture of food. Right, so that first node there is spitting out a 1 if it's a picture of food, or a 0 if it is a picture of something else that's not food. Okay, and then perhaps this second node at the bottom is asking, does it come in a bun? Right? Lots of things could come in a bun. Your hair could be up in a bun, right? So, this node, the second node that we're looking at in this layer after the input layer here, this second node is checking something different than the first node, right? Does it come in a bun? Either yes, it does, or no, it doesn't. And then what's going to happen is both of those nodes are going to pass on their information to the final node. And then that final node, that output layer node here, is going to be able to tell us whether or not we are looking at a picture of a hot dog. So this is a basic structure of a hard threshold neural network. Note it's not for a very important task. Is it a hot dog or is it not a hot dog? So something you might get that reference from Silicon Valley. Jin Yang develops an app, and the only thing his app can do is tell you whether or not the picture you put into it is a hot dog or not a hot dog. So some inspiration there. Thank you, HBO. So the general structure of a neural network. Okay, we have this input layer where we are feeding in our data. Here is our input layer. Okay, but we also have hidden layers. Okay, and these hidden layers involve using outputs from the previous layer as inputs in the following layer. All right, so we're taking inputs and we're transforming them into outputs, and we're feeding them as inputs into other nodes. And note here that each of these nodes themselves, where we used to have a picture of some sort of hard threshold function here, we just have what looks like theta showing up. And remember what that was from our logistic regression study. Okay, that was this soft threshold function. So we could think about Instead of for the nodes using some sort of hard threshold classifier, we could use a soft threshold classifier for a classification problem if we wanted to. So you can think about each of these thetas here as a different logistic regression equation, potentially checking a different class of something, and then feeding that information as inputs into the next layer, which makes a decision based on that about a different feature, which feeds into a later layer. And this last layer here, we refer to that as the output layer. So this is the basic structure of a neural network. You have layers and layers and layers potentially of, in some sense, regressions feeding into regressions feeding into regressions, where the output of one is an input in the next. And what that means is, for example, if you were to look at the specific regression equation for this layer here in orange, or for this particular node, okay, well, we have these inputs going in. So we got some x's. What are those x's? Well, they're the y's, the outputs from the previous layer. And then they're multiplied by the betas. But the betas are really hard to interpret in this setting, unfortunately, in that they are, multiplicative transformations of other variables that have been transformed and transformed and transformed. So the downside of a neural network is that the structure of these hidden layers, to some extent, means that we are dealing essentially with a black box. We can't really tell what's going on inside in terms of causality here. Okay. So if you need a model that provides a lot of transparency, for example, regression analysis, right? Linear regression, you can tell exactly how this variable affects the y variable because you can measure the beta, you can take that partial derivative and see exactly that partial effect. So the neural network, right? A couple issues to deal with here. The hidden layers are exactly that. They're hidden. After it's built, all the user really observes without, rigorously mining that neural network is the input layer of raw data and the output layer, which is telling you your prediction. Everything that's happening in between within the hidden layers involves the creation of new features, new inputs that move into the later layers. And these could be very highly nonlinear transforms of the original inputs, making the interpretation of the betas, the weights in any given layer, not really interpretable. Okay, the features tend to lose their meanings because of that. But that's okay, because people are not the ones assessing the information in the neural network. The computer is, right? The computer is the one doing the looking for patterns, and the computer is way better at that than we are. So even though, as humans, we couldn't describe exactly what this variable is, it's a high nonlinear transform, square of the cube of the log to the e power, even though that we couldn't describe what that feature is, the computer can still quantify it and understand that there is relevance to that feature within pattern recognition. The algorithm we use to calibrate a neural network is something called, more generally, the back propagation algorithm. And we're not going to go into an excruciating amount of detail here, which involves quite a bit of linear algebra and recursion through that tree, through that neural network. And we're going to basically do the following. We're going to start off by assuming some guess at our weight vector throughout the network. And what we're going to do is we're going to forward compute or propagate through the neural network to figure out what the predicted value is at the end of the network for our guess. Okay, so this sounds familiar. We have some initialization, we initialize a weight vector, and for that weight, we forward compute it, we get a prediction, and then we compare that prediction to the actual value from the input data. So we can get some error measure here, right? Which means we can now compute the cost of that guess. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use back propagation to move backwards through the neural network and compute the gradient vector of the cost function by moving backwards through the neural network. Okay, and what we're basically going to do once we have our cost function and the gradient assessed, we're going to be able to apply, you guessed it, some form of gradient descent. Okay? And stochastic gradient descent is often used in calibrating neural networks. So that is the backpropagation algorithm. It leverages stochastic gradient descent to calibrate all of those betas through every layer, right, through every node in that neural network. Pros and cons of the neural network. Pro is lots of open source packages that allow you to run a neural net. You can do it in R, you can do it in Python. Great out of sample prediction provided. Model complexity is not too crazy. And again, this is a pretty general statement here. It can be used for classification and regression problems, as I mentioned. I know the focus lately has been on classification. Gradient descent is definitely applicable to this discussion. Downside, backpropagation is computationally intensive. And unfortunately, if we're looking for a transparent model, we don't really get that with the neural net because of the nature of the hidden layer here. Okay, features are generally not interpretable, as well as the coefficients associated with those features and the partial effects, which means untangling causal relationships can be a little tricky at times with the neural net. So let's go ahead and shift gears a little bit and talk about a few different algorithms before we get out of here. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Stay tuned for more on CART, random forests, and some clustering. See you soon.